While planning his lavish wedding, my son looked me straight in the eye and said, "Your life has nothing to be proud of. Don't show up and embarrass me." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply nodded like a silent old man who knew his place. But while they were busy perfecting their flawless ceremony, I quietly made a few decisions of my own decisions that would turn their biggest day into something they would never forget. Hello everyone, welcome to the story. Before we open the door to what really started everything, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Quick note, some elements in this story are fictionalized for storytelling and reflection, and any similarities are purely coincidental. The leather-bound binder hit my grandmother's oak coffee table with a sound like a gavel. And just like that, the piece of my retirement was declared dead. Thane Garrison, a 68-year-old retired lead engineer whose hands still bore the faint calluses of a man who built his own dreams, sat in the shadow of my Victorian home, watching the Columbia River flow toward the Pacific. The river was indifferent to the sudden intrusion, but I felt the shift in the air immediately. Silas Garrison, 32, and draped in an Italian-cut suit that cost more than my first car, walked into the living room with the polished stride of a man who mistook his father's generosity for his own merit. Beside him stood Natalie Ashford, a 30-year-old art consultant whose smile was as curated and cold as the galleries she managed. She already seemed to be appraising the Victorian moldings of my home for their market value. They didn't come for coffee or to ask about my health. This visit was a cold professional audit. I realized within seconds that I was being treated as a sole financier, with zero voting power in the very event I was expected to fund. Silas didn't wait for me to speak. "Dad, we've made the final decisions," he said, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Natalie smoothed her skirt and sat on the edge of the leather sofa, her posture perfect and empty. "This is about a certain standard, Thane," she added, her eyes locking onto mine with a practiced sharpness. "I'm sure you appreciate that." I took a sip of my coffee, which had gone bitter in the pot, and felt the weight of their expectations pressing against the room. Have you ever looked at someone you raised and realized you're staring at a total stranger? The boy I taught to build model rockets was gone, replaced by this mannequin of corporate ambition who smelled of expensive cologne and misplaced confidence. Silas opened the binder, the gold-embossed letters on the cover catching the late afternoon sun. He began flipping through glossy pages of venues and vendors with the clinical efficiency of a project manager. I watched the numbers with an aerospace engineer's eye, looking for the stress loads, the points where the structural integrity of a budget would inevitably fail. He pointed to a photo of an estate in the hills. $185,000 for the venue alone. I noted, my voice sounding gravelly even to my own ears. "It's an investment in our future network." Dad, Silas countered, his hands moving with a fluid, dismissive grace. "Don't look at it as just a party. We need to be seen in the right light." Natalie nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of a catering menu that listed hors d'oeuvres at $60 a head. It was more than a party. It was a performance, and I was the silent producer being billed for every curtain call. The numbers continued to climb, spiraling into a stratosphere that made no sense for a one-day commitment. $400,000 for 6 hours. The math didn't just feel wrong, it felt like a declaration of war. I looked at the spreadsheet Silas proudly displayed. He was treating my retirement fund like a venture capital pool, and Natalie was the consultant, ensuring the brand was sufficiently elevated. "Silas," I started, leaning forward. "You are talking about nearly $500,000 for a single evening." Silas sighed, a sound of profound disappointment that made my blood run cold. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he said, looking at Natalie for support. "Your engineering mind is just too simple for these kinds of social status calculations, Dad. You see bolts and tolerances, but we are building a legacy." Natalie gave a small, condescending smile that never reached her eyes. It was clear they viewed my life's work as nothing more than raw material, to be refined into their social climbing gear. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the distant hum of the river and the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Silas closed the binder with a snap that echoed in the empty room, leaned forward and said, Oh, by the way, we need to talk about the house. My pulse, usually as steady as a flight deck clock, skipped a beat as Silas spoke about my home as if it were a piece of scrap metal ready for the foundry. I felt a tightening in my chest, a physical resistance to the air in my own living room. The Victorian was not just a structure, it was a record of my life. Silas looked at me, his eyes devoid of the nostalgia that usually softened a man's gaze when looking at his childhood home. We've already scouted the new place, Dad, he said, leaning back with a casualness that felt like an insult. It's about positioning. The market is peaking, and the equity in this place is just sitting idle when it could be the down payment for a proper estate in the Ashford neighborhood. Natalie leaned in her saccharine sympathy, coating her words like a cheap glaze. Think of it as a fresh start, Thane. You're rattling around in here with ghosts. A managed community would be so much more efficient for you. No gutters to clean, no drafts to worry about. They were speaking about liquidation, not a move. Silas reached into his expensive leather bag and pulled out a thin blue folder, sliding it across the oak table. I didn't even have to open it to see the bold lettering of a local real estate firm. I haven't just thought about it, Dad. I already had an unofficial appraisal done. It's a gold mine. I felt a coldness wash over me as I touched the texture of the appraisal folder. He had invited a stranger into my home, my sanctuary, without a word to me. In aerospace, we call it a structural failure, when a support beam looks solid but has already snapped on the inside. That was my son. My mind flashed back to the summer of 1985. The sun hitting the river through the kitchen window had looked exactly as it did now, but the air back then smelled of wet cement and sweat. Catherine and I had laid every brick in that garden ourselves. I remembered the grit of the mortar against my palms, and the way we'd triple-checked the level on the kitchen sills, because she wanted them perfect for her herb pots. Your mother and I built this with our own hands, Silas, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I felt the phantom weight of a trowel in my right hand, a memory of a time when we were building a future, not carving one up for parts. Silas let out a short, sharp laugh. And that's the problem, Dad. You're living in a museum of 1985. You're clinging to a pile of bricks while your family's status is at stake. Natalie's perfume, something sharp and floral, began to linger in the room, cloying and invasive. She watched me with the patient expression of a doctor explaining a terminal diagnosis to a stubborn patient. They didn't see the history. They didn't see the blood and bone in the foundation. How do you tell someone that the dent in the floorboards from where Silas dropped his first bike is more precious than a six-figure check? You don't. You can't. The realization settled into my bones like a deep winter frost. Silas wasn't just asking for money to fund a party. He was asking to erase Catherine's legacy so he could buy a ticket into a world that would never truly accept him. He stood up, smoothing the front of his jacket, signaling the end of the presentation. Natalie rose with him, her eyes already back on her phone. We'll let you process the numbers, Silas said, heading toward the foyer. Natalie paused at the door, her hand resting on the brass latch I'd polished just last week. Oh, and Thane, we've already scheduled a staging consultant to drop by next Tuesday, just to give us some ideas on how to clear out the clutter. The front door clicked shut, leaving me in a house that suddenly felt like a tomb, staring at the empty binder on the table and realizing the diagnostic phase was over. Sleep is a luxury for those with an intact foundation, but tonight, every creak of the floorboards sounded like a structural warning I'd been ignoring for years. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies the steady rhythmic ticking of the wall clock until it feels like a countdown. I stood in the hallway, my hand resting on the smooth oak banister, feeling the hollow ache they had left behind. Silas and Natalie had treated my home like an asset to be liquidated, but I was beginning to realize the rot went deeper than a single conversation. I found myself drifting toward Catherine's sewing room, a place I usually avoided after dark. I had left it untouched, a time capsule of lavender scents and silver thimbles. I should have listened to you, Catherine, I whispered to the shadows. You knew the bolts were loose before the bridge was even built. My mercy, after she passed, had become Silas's entitlement. I had overcompensated for his loss by filling his hands with everything he asked for, never noticing that his grip had turned predatory. I realized then that my emergency credit card, a safety net I'd maintained for him for 12 years, wasn't just being used for wedding deposits. The diagnostic phase had moved from the house to the numbers. I turned away from the sewing room and walked into my study, the room where aerospace precision reigned supreme. The cold hum of the refrigerator in the distance was the only other living thing in the house as I sat at my desk. The smell of old paper and stale coffee usually grounded me, but tonight it felt like the scent of a stagnant life. I opened my laptop, the blue glow of the screen reflecting in my glasses as I logged into my primary financial accounts. Cross-referencing the glossy wedding master plan binder with my bank statements became a forensic mission. Do you know what it feels like to realize the person you die for has been treating you like a terminal insurance policy? It's a specialized kind of nausea that settles in the gut and refuses to leave. As the spreadsheets populated, the truth began to emerge with sickening clarity. The emergency card I gave Silas hadn't just been used for the occasional flat tire or medical copay. It had been funding a luxury lifestyle for over 6 months in secret. I saw charges for 5-star hotels in cities he never mentioned, visiting dinner tabs at restaurants that cost a week's pension, and designer retail purchases that made no sense for a man claiming to be struggling with wedding costs. My son wasn't just asking for help, he was ransacking my future while I slept. I felt the dry texture of the printed bank statements under my fingers, my mind automatically calculating the burn rate of my retirement funds. The data was unequivocal. People lie, but the numbers are always honest. I decided to pull a full credit report, a technical precaution I hadn't taken in a decade. My hands were steady, even as the air in the study grew thin. When the report finally loaded, the results hit me with the force of a high-altitude decompression. $89,000. That wasn't a wedding budget. That was a ransacking. The report showed 3 additional credit cards I didn't recognize, all opened in my name within the last year. Every single one was maxed out. I traced the paper trail looking for the billing address. Silas hadn't just been irresponsible. He had rerouted the physical bills to a secret P.O. box in a neighborhood across the river. He had committed full-scale identity theft against his own father. The blue light of the monitor reflected in my eyes as I stared at the P.O. box address, an address I didn't own, for a debt I didn't authorize, and I knew I wasn't just dealing with a spoiled son anymore. I was dealing with a criminal. I watched the steam rise from my black coffee, the heat from the ceramic mug, the only warmth I felt as I waited for my son to explain why he'd spent the last 6 months picking my pockets. The morning sun hit the Columbia River with a blinding clarity, silver light dancing on the water in a way that should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt like a spotlight on the mess I had discovered in the blue light of my monitor just hours before. I had spent the night dissecting the digital trail of a criminal, and the fact that the criminal shared my DNA made the bitter taste of my espresso almost unbearable. I sat at a small corner table in the Riverside Roastery, the familiar smell of burnt espresso, usually a comfort, now merely a reminder of the scorched earth between me and the boy I'd raised. The cold hum of a Tesla's motor signaled his arrival before I even saw the car. Silas pulled into a spot directly in my line of sight, the sleek white vehicle, a jarring contrast to my reliable battle-worn Honda, parked 3 stalls away. He stepped out, adjusting his cuffs, and walked toward the glass doors with the impatient importance of a CEO. Silas didn't apologize for the theft when he sat down. Instead, he checked his expensive watch with a scowl. "Make it quick, Dad," he said, his voice flat and businesslike. "I have a strategy call at 10. I didn't reach for my coffee. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table. "I think you'll find this particular strategy more urgent," I replied. Silas raised an eyebrow, his polished facade unbothered. He truly believed this was just another lecture on fiscal responsibility, a necessary bridge loan of sorts to meet the Ashford family's lofty expectations. He looked like a man who'd been caught trying to weld a diamond onto a lead pipe. Expensive, shiny, and fundamentally broken. I didn't waste time on a preamble. I pulled the manila folder from beside me and pushed it across the table. The scratch of the folder on the wood sounded like a blade in the quiet morning air. Silas opened it, his eyes scanning the first few pages. I watched the blood drain from his face. The cocky tilt of his head vanished, replaced by the cornered animal look I'd seen a dozen times when he was a teenager caught in a lie. $89,000, Silas. Across 3 cards you opened in my name. I kept my voice low, clinical, the same tone I used to report a catastrophic engine failure during a test flight. I detailed the dates, the locations, and the secret P.O. box he'd used to hide the paper trail. It wasn't like that. He stammered, his hands beginning to shake as he flipped through the bank statements. I was going to pay it back once the wedding gifts came in. It was a bridge, Dad. You don't understand the pressure Natalie puts on me to match her father's lifestyle. Do you know what it's like to realize your own son views your life's work as a stain he needs to bleach out? I looked at his polished loafers, then back at his eyes. He wasn't even looking at the debt. He was looking for a way to spin it. You stole my identity, Silas. That's a felony. He scoffed then, a sharp, defensive sound that made my chest tighten. A felony between family. Don't be dramatic. I'm in Ashford now, or I will be soon. They don't care about blueprints or bridges, Dad. They care about who you are. And right now, frankly, you're just embarrassing. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low hiss that cut deeper than any financial theft. I've been keeping you away from Natalie's parents for a reason. Your blue-collar aesthetic, that engineering vibe, it doesn't fit the brand we're building. They live in the real world where status is the only currency that matters. You're just a line item they don't need to see. I felt the weight of my father's pocket watch in my pocket, a heavy, solid piece of history that Silas seemed determined to bury under a mountain of fake prestige. Silas leaned in, his voice a low hiss that cut deeper than any financial theft. The Ashfords live in the real world, Dad. They don't care about blueprints or bridges. They care about who you are. And right now you're just embarrassing. The 1952 Hamilton pocket watch felt like a lead weight against my thigh, a piece of cold ticking history that Silas was about to spit on. As I walked back to my car, the silence of the parking lot seemed to amplify the words he had just used to dismantle our relationship. I had been called many things in my life, stubborn, demanding, precise, but never an embarrassment. The weight in my pocket wasn't just gold and gears. It was the physical manifestation of a lineage Silas was currently trying to incinerate. I drove home with a clinical focus, my hands tight on the steering wheel, my mind already running a diagnostic on the wreckage of our conversation. I realized then that Silas wasn't just ignoring his heritage, he actively despised it, viewing the very tools and timepieces of his ancestors as symbols of a poverty he thought he had escaped through theft and proximity to the Ashfords. When I reached the Riverside Victorian, I went straight to the heavy oak cabinet in my study. I retrieved a small, worn velvet box, its deep blue fabric faded to the color of a bruised twilight. Inside lay the Hamilton. I remembered the day Catherine brought it home from the restorers shortly after Silas was born. Her eyes had been full of a hopeful, luminous joy. She wanted him to have something that stood for precision and pride. I opened the case, the smell of old copper and oil faint but unmistakable. Inside, the intricate engraving of Silas's full name caught the dying afternoon light. "This was supposed to be your foundation, Silas," I whispered to the empty room. "Not a burden." I ran my thumb over the smooth gold casing, feeling the steady rhythmic pulse of the movement. Tick, tick, tick. The watch was still keeping time. My son, however, was out of it. He was moving at a speed that ignored the laws of friction and consequence. I sat in the dim light of the study for an hour, watching the river turn to a dark, unreflective slate. Then I picked up the phone. I needed to know if there was even a fragment of the boy left under that Italian wool suit. It was a final stress test of his soul. Silas answered on the third ring, his voice sounding sharp and tinny over the speaker. "Make it fast, Dad. I'm headed to a tasting." "Silas," I said, keeping my voice as level as a horizon line, "I've been thinking about your wedding gift. I have your great-grandfather's 1952 Hamilton here. It's been fully serviced. It's a railroad piece, solid gold. I want you to wear it when you stand at that altar." There was a pause, and for a second I hoped for a glimmer of recognition. Then came the laughter. It was a harsh, jagged sound that grated against my ears. Are you serious? Silas asked, the derision thick in his throat. A railroad worker's antique good, for him that he carried it. Dad, but I'm marrying an Ashford. I can't show up with a piece of working-class relic, no matter how polished it is on my wrist. Have you ever heard the sound of a memory being crushed? It sounds exactly like a son laughing at his mother's pride. He didn't stop there. He began bragging about the Patek Philippe that Natalie's father had promised him for the rehearsal dinner, a $500,000 leash he mistook for a trophy. Honestly, Dad, this is why you never made anything of yourself compared to men like Richard Ashford. You and Mom always clung to this sentimental junk like it was actual capital. No wonder you're still stuck in that drafty museum. The insult to Catherine's memory hit me with the force of a physical blow, leaving a cold clarity in its wake. He wasn't just rejecting a watch, he was declaring our entire history garbage. The Ashfords hadn't just bought his loyalty, they had rewritten his software. I hung up the phone before the dial tone could mock me, staring at the watch in my palm and realizing the last thread of the boy I raised had snapped. The kitchen was thick with the scent of rosemary and slow-cooked beef, a fragrance that usually meant family, but tonight, it felt like I was preparing a last meal for a relationship that had already died. I watched the steam rising from the heavy cast-iron pot, a vessel Catherine had seasoned over decades of Sunday dinners. I had spent the afternoon methodically chopping carrots and searing the meat, seeking the cold comfort of a repeatable process. My hands moved with a discipline born of 40 years in aerospace engineering, but my mind was occupied with a different kind of calculation. I hadn't just looked at the wedding budget they shoved at me. I had spent the previous night performing a full-spectrum analysis of my entire financial lifespan down to the cent. The data showed a terrifying trajectory. If I followed their plan, the structural integrity of my retirement would collapse within 3 years, leaving me destitute. Just like you used to make it, Catherine? I murmured, the simple and honest aroma of the stew filling the air. I set the dining table with the precision of a pre-flight mission checklist, the heavy silverware clinking against the dark oak in a rhythmic solitary cadence. When Silas and Natalie arrived at 7, the air in the foyer immediately shifted. Silas carried a bottle of wine with a label I didn't recognize, though the cold condensation on the glass and the gold foil told me it cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Natalie entered with a sharp, perfunctory nod, her eyes darting around the room as if checking for dust on a museum exhibit. We sat down, but the warmth of the meal failed to penetrate the stifling formality they brought with them. Natalie barely touched her plate, pushing a starch-heavy potato around with her fork. "It's a bit heavy for us, Dad, but thanks for the effort," Silas said, his voice carrying a condescending weight. I took a bite of my own meal, tasting the depth of the red wine reduction and the salt, a stark contrast to the hollow conversation about Ashford charity galas. A bridge is only as strong as its weakest bolt. I was looking across the table at 2 bolts that had been rusted through for years, held together only by the superficial polish of their social ambitions. They weren't here for the food, and I wasn't here to play the doting father. I waited until they had both reached a lull in their chatter about floral arrangements. "I didn't invite you here for the stew," I said, my voice as level and unyielding as a granite slab. "I invited you here for the data." I stood up and cleared the plates, ignoring Silas's look of irritation. When I returned, I carried a thin, worn manila folder. I'd mapped out every credit card charge, every bridge loan, and the ultimate cost of their proposed wedding at Sterling Heights. Have you ever sat across from your own blood and felt like you were negotiating with a hostile corporate raider? It's a specialized kind of exhaustion. I opened the folder and laid out the spreadsheets. I showed them the math, the hard, unalterable truth of what their investment would do to my life. "I've reached my structural limit," I told them, watching the way Natalie's jaw tightened. Silas started to speak a defensive line about family legacy, but I reached into my pocket. I pulled out a cashier's check, the paper white and stark against the dark oak table. It was made out for $120,000. "This isn't a contribution, Silas," I said, sliding the check slowly toward the center of the table. "This is a buyout. It is my absolute and final offer. Take this and the house stays mine. The wedding budget, the emergency cards, the hidden debts, they all stop here." I slid the check into the center of the table, the paper white and stark against the dark oak, and watched as Silas's eyes narrowed into something I'd only ever seen in predators. Silas didn't reach for the check. He stared at it, as if I'd just placed a dead rodent on the table, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated vitriol. The silence in the dining room was absolute heavy, with the scent of rosemary that now seemed to mock the warmth of the meal I had prepared. I watched his eyes track the paper, his jaw working with a tension that threatened to snap. Natalie didn't even pretend to look. She sat with her arms crossed, her cold, approving smile acting as a silent fuel for the fire I could see building behind my son's eyes. 120,000 Silas finally spoke, and his laughter was a jagged, ugly sound that tore through the quiet. The Ashfords spent more than that on the rehearsal dinner alone. You really have no idea, do you, huh? He stood up so abruptly his chair shrieked against the oak floor, and he began to pace the room like a predator in a cage that had grown too small. I felt a coldness settle in my chest as he revealed a deeper betrayal. I've already told the Ashfords that you're unwell, Dad, that you're declining. I had to explain why you've been so difficult, so irrational. I was setting the stage to protect them from your small-mindedness. But this pittance is an insult to the life I'm building. He stopped at the window, his silhouette dark against the evening sky. You've spent 40 years building things no one sees, Dad. Meaningless scribbles on blueprints for engines that people just use and forget. You're small, you're practical, and frankly, you're irrelevant. Worthless. That was the word he threw at me. Not budgeted or insufficient, worthless, like a bridge that leads to nowhere. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the table, feeling the rising stoicism that usually served me during catastrophic structural failures. Silas wasn't just rejecting the money, he was attempting a systematic verbal demolition of my entire existence. Natalie stood up then, the silk of her dress rustling with a sound like dry leaves. We're leaving, Silas. There's no point in negotiating with someone who is clearly out of touch with reality. Silas turned back to me, but he didn't move toward the door. He leaned over the table, his knuckles white as he pressed them into the wood. Then he took a step closer, close enough that I could smell the expensive cologne, mixed with the sour tang of rage. His hand shot out and swept the $120,000 check off the table. It fluttered to the floor between us like a severed lifeline. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, a tone I had never heard from him. You should be careful, Dad. This house has a lot of stairs, and you're not as sharp as you used to be. Things happen to people your age. Falls, accidents, memory lapses that require professional intervention. He took another step, and I felt the edge of the table press into my ribs as he loomed over me. It would be a shame if something happened before I could properly manage your affairs. I didn't move. I let the hidden camera on the bookshelf, the one I'd installed the day I found the guardianship petition, capture every word, every gesture, every flash of violence in his eyes. The threat was as clear as a blueprint. My own son was looking at me and seeing an obstacle to be removed, a line item to be cleared from a ledger. Have you ever felt your own blood turn to ice while your heart was still on fire? That's what it sounds like when your son wishes you dead for a down payment. I felt the taste of bile in my throat, a physical reaction to the absolute heartbreak of that moment. Don't even bother showing up to the wedding, Silas spat, turning his back on me. You'd just be an embarrassment to the Ashford name. You're dead to this family already. He grabbed Natalie's arm and stormed toward the hallway. The house vibrated as he reached the front door. He slammed it with such unbridled fury that the picture frames on the wall rattled the sound echoing through the hollow rooms of my life. I stood alone in the dining room, the sharp scent of his expensive cologne still lingering in the stagnant heat of the house. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against the clinical calm of my thoughts. I looked down and realized that in his blind rage to exit, Silas had left something behind. His leather messenger bag sat on the armchair by the door, forgotten. It was a heavy, expensive thing, the container of his darkest premeditated plans, and right now it felt like a ticking bomb in my living room. The silence in the house didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like the heavy ionized air before a lightning strike centered entirely on the Italian leather bag sitting on my armchair. I stood alone in the dining room, my gaze fixed on that forgotten object. The smell of expensive leather and Silas's lingering cologne fought with the fading scent of my rosemary stew, creating a sensory dissonance that mirrored the chaos in my chest. Silas had left the bag in his blind, indignant fury to exit, and as I stared at it, I felt an invisible threshold rising before me. In aerospace, ignoring anomalous data during a flight test is how people die. I carried that lesson in my marrow. If there was intelligence to be gathered, I couldn't afford the luxury of a guilty conscience. I approached the chair, my hands steady even as the adrenaline spiked. Data doesn't have a conscience, I whispered to the empty room, and tonight neither do I. I felt the expensive grain of the leather as I unzipped the main compartment. The sound of the zipper was a sharp clinical intrusion in the quiet house. Inside, I found a thick manila legal folder. My fingertips caught a slight paper-cut sting on the edge of the first sheet, but I ignored it. The blinding white of the legal document seemed to glare back at me under the dining room lights. I began to read, and the blood in my veins turned to liquid nitrogen. It was a petition for guardianship. My own son had spent the last several weeks coordinating with a boutique law firm to draft a document that would strip me of my autonomy. In engineering, we look for fatigue cracks. This wasn't a crack. The entire support column had been hollowed out by termites in designer suits. The document cited a fabricated dementia diagnosis, painting me as an aging man whose irrational financial decisions, like refusing to fund a lavish wedding, were evidence of a cognitive decline. The most damning part was the date. This wasn't a heated reaction to our argument tonight. It was a calculated move drafted 2 weeks before he even set foot in my house for the audit. He wanted to bury me alive in a managed care facility just to get the keys to the safe and the deed to this house. I felt a cold, focused fury replace the shock. I reached back into the bag and pulled out Silas's laptop. It was open, the screen glowing with a soft blue light, and it began to vibrate rhythmically against the table as incoming messages flooded in. I shouldn't have looked, but the name on the screen was Natalie. The messages, however, weren't meant for Silas. He had apparently left a secondary messaging app open, one linked to a cloud account he shared with his fiancée. The exchanges weren't between Silas and Natalie. They were between Natalie and a man named Tyler Ashford, her cousin-in-law. Have you ever seen the person who destroyed your life being destroyed by the person they love? It should feel like justice, but it just felt like rot. I scrolled through months of correspondence. They spoke about the Garrison inheritance as if it were a carcass they were waiting to pick clean. Once we get the old man's house and the trust, we can stop pretending with Silas. Natalie had written just 3 days ago. Tyler's response was even colder, suggesting they keep Silas on a short leash until the Ashford corporate expansion needed more liquidity. Natalie, you're not a bride, I thought, as I watched the green power light of the laptop blink like a slow, steady heartbeat. You're a vulture, and my son, the man who just threatened my life, was too blinded by the Ashford name to realize he was the one being served up for dinner. I sat in the dark, the white light of the legal documents still burned into my retinas. Chilling clarity is a strange thing. It strips away the noise and leaves you with a single unyielding path. I closed the laptop. Silas wasn't just my enemy, he was a victim of a much larger predator, and I was the only one who knew the truth. A sharp, jagged pain bloomed behind my sternum, a reminder that while my mind was still calculating flight paths, my 68-year-old heart was struggling to handle the atmospheric pressure of this betrayal. I sat in the darkness of my study, the laptop screen before me, showing the skeletal remains of Silas's loyalty. I realized that by being declared incompetent, I would lose every shred of leverage I had left. I wouldn't just lose the house. I would lose the ability to stop the wedding or protect the legacy Catherine and I had spent decades building. I had to act before that petition hit the courthouse floor. I slumped back into my leather desk chair, fighting through the cold sweat on my forehead and the trembling in my hands. The metallic taste of adrenaline coated my tongue, bitter and sharp. I looked at Catherine's portrait, her eyes steady and kind, even in the dim gray pre-dawn light. Not yet, I whispered, clutching the edge of the desk. until the wood bit into my palms. I can't break until the structure is safe. Forgive me, Catherine. I have to tear down the home we built to save the values we lived by. This was no longer a disagreement over a budget. It was a salvage operation in the middle of a catastrophic failure. I breathed through the tightness in my chest, forcing my heart to find a rhythm that didn't feel like a dying engine. In aerospace, you don't argue with a failing engine. You cut the fuel lines and hope you have enough altitude to glide to safety. That was precisely what I intended to do. I pulled out a fresh, yellow legal pad, the scratch of the pencil against the paper, loud in the heavy silence of the 4 o'clock hour. My 68-year-old hands eventually steadied, and I began sketching a meticulous abort sequence. I listed the evidence I had gathered: the $89,000 in fraud, the identity theft, the premeditated guardianship petition, and the sickening proof of Natalie's affair with Tyler Ashford. The numbers and dates formed a grid of undeniable corruption. I realized that simply calling the police was too slow a process. The law is a slow-moving freighter when I needed the speed of a jet. This isn't a legal battle anymore, I muttered to the empty room. It's a structural realignment. I needed to execute a moral correction that Silas could never recover from. A lesson in accountability that would strip away the designer suits and the Ashford gloss to reveal the hollow core beneath. How much of your own heart are you willing to sacrifice to save your soul? I was about to find out. I decided then that I wouldn't press charges for the fraud immediately. That $89,000 wasn't just a loss. It was the ultimate leverage for my own flight plan. If I handed him over to the authorities now, the Ashfords would simply cut him loose and find a new way to pick at my bones. No, I needed Silas in play just long enough to ensure he was the one who pulled the trigger on his own social execution. The rhythmic thud of my heart in my ears began to subside, replaced by a cold, strategic empowerment. I mapped out the stakeholders, the financial conduits, and the legal barriers. I saw the weak points in Silas's and Natalie's alliance cracks that only needed a little thermal expansion to shatter. I put down my pencil as the sun began to bleed over the Columbia River, my flight plan complete and my first call scheduled for exactly 8 o'clock. The pre-dawn light was no longer a harbinger of gloom. It was the illumination I needed to begin the demolition. I stared at the yellow pad, at the lines and arrows that dictated the end of my son's carefully constructed lie, and I felt a strange, surgically clean peace. The diagnostic phase was over. Now the correction would begin. The morning sun was a cold, sharp blade reflecting off the Columbia River as I pulled away from my driveway. I had barely slept, but the strategic flight plan I had drafted in the gray hours of the dawn kept me upright. By the time I reached the high-rise offices across the bridge in Portland, my heart had settled into a heavy, rhythmic thrum. I didn't wait for the receptionist to announce me. I walked into David Miller's office with the heavy stride of a man about to scuttle a billion-dollar vessel to keep it from falling into enemy hands. David Miller, a man whose tailored gray suits and silver hair projected the stability of a century-old bank, had managed my portfolio with the same caution I used to calculate atmospheric drag. He looked up from his mahogany desk, surprised by my uncharacteristic intrusion. "David, I'm not here for a quarterly review," I said, dropping the manila folder of Silas's sins onto his desk. "I'm here to build a fortress." I watched his professional mask slip into a look of genuine horror as he scanned the evidence of identity theft and the fraudulent debt trail. This wasn't just about protecting my capital. I was intentionally liquidating the very accounts Silas was planning to use as collateral for the new Ashford house he and Natalie had already picked out. David looked at me, his eyes sharp with protective anger. "Thane, this isn't just a family dispute," he muttered, his voice echoing in the hushed silence of the office. "This is a felony. We need to lock this down before he drains you dry." I sat in one of the expensive leather chairs, the smell of furniture polish and wealth thick in the air. Outside the blue-tinted glass windows, the city of Portland was waking up oblivious to the fact that I was about to perform a surgical strike on my own estate. A trust is like a heat shield. It's designed to burn up so the payload stays safe. My life's work was the payload. The shield was about to get very hot. David began pulling up the digital architecture of my life on his screen. We talked about hardening the assets, moving them into an irrevocable trust. I told him to start the liquidation of the primary stock portfolio immediately. I wanted the cash moved before Silas could even refresh his banking app. Every time David clicked his mouse, I felt a cold sense of relief, as if I were cutting the mooring lines of a ship that had been taken by pirates. If he tries to use that guardianship petition now, David, what happens? I asked, watching the quiet whir of a paper shredder in the corner as it ate the old documents. David leaned back, the metal of his executive pen glinting in the light. He'll be suing an empty shell, Thane. The money won't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the trust. You become a non-entity for the purposes of his greed. Have you ever signed a paper that effectively made you poor on paper just so you could be powerful in reality? It's a strange kind of freedom. I felt that freedom now, a lightness in my chest that had nothing to do with health and everything to do with resolve. We spent the next hour moving numbers across the digital ether. Thousands of hours of my sweat and Catherine's frugality were being rerouted into a legal bunker Silas could never penetrate. David revealed a final crucial detail: because the trust was irrevocable, not even a court-ordered guardian could undo these transfers once the ink was dry. Silas could take my autonomy perhaps, but he would find the vault empty and the door welded shut. The smooth, cold weight of the metal pen felt heavier than a wrench as I signed the final page. I was officially a ghost in my son's financial world. I handed the pen back to David, my fingertips feeling the dry sting of paper cuts from the morning's work. The diagnostic was over, the repairs were impossible, and the only thing left was the controlled demolition. The pen clicked one last time, a final sound that signaled the fortress was locked. The drive across town felt like navigating a flight path through heavy turbulence, but my hands remained steady on the wheel. I had just finished making myself a ghost in my own financial world with David, and now it was time to provide that ghost with a legal edge. I pulled up to the sharp, angular glass building that housed Morrison Legal, a structure that looked more like a fortress than a law firm. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass of Patricia Morrison's office, the Portland skyline looking like a circuit board I was about to rewire from the ground up. Patricia Morrison, a 42-year-old attorney, with a reputation for being as sharp and cold as a surgical scalpel, sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single block of obsidian. The room smelled of expensive toner and ozone, a sterile environment where emotions were secondary to evidence. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I placed the leather bag Silas had forgotten on her desk and pulled out the legal folder I had found inside. I want to build a foundation, Patricia, I said, my voice resonating with a calm, analytical strength. But first, I need you to look at how my son intended to destroy me. I watched her as she reviewed the guardianship petition and the identity theft logs. Her expression shifted from professional detachment to a clinical predatory focus. She didn't look like a lawyer. She looked like a lead structural inspector finding a fatal stress crack. And she was smiling. Mr. Garrison, what your son has done isn't just a betrayal. It's a crime. She set her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor as she stood to pace. We're not just defending you. We're initiating a total asset extraction. My son had already drafted a plan to declare me incompetent, a move to bury me in managed care and seize this very house. I explained to Patricia that I wasn't interested in a mere defensive posture. I wanted to replace what Silas thought he was entitled to with something that actually carried weight. I want to name a specific scholarship after him, I told her, the thought bringing a cold sense of justice to my mind. But the criteria will force recipients to embody the blue-collar values Silas spent his life trying to erase. They will be first-generation STEM students who understand the grit of a day's work. Catherine always said a life without service is like a bridge without a foundation. It might look good, but it won't hold weight. Patricia nodded, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the cold, smooth surface of her obsidian desk. The Silas Garrison Humility Scholarship, she mused. It's poetic, Thane, and legally ironclad. We spent the next hour defining the Catherine Garrison Memorial Scholarship Foundation. I wanted to use the exact funds Silas intended to waste on a 6-hour performance of status at Sterling Heights to build a perpetual engine of opportunity. Have you ever seen a master architect look at a condemned building? That was Patricia, looking at my son's future. She was already drafting the mission statement, her legal lethality matching my engineering precision. The blinding white light of the office reflected off the glass as she outlined our next steps. I took a sip of the metallic, lukewarm office water, feeling a surge of vindictive satisfaction. I was finally building something that would last, unlike the hollow life Silas was chasing. Patricia informed me of a crucial detail that made the air in the room feel lighter. Because I am the primary financier of all the wedding contracts, I don't need Silas's permission to cancel a single one of them. I don't need to argue and I don't need to negotiate. I just need to stop the checks. Patricia leaned back, the city lights reflecting in her sharp eyes, and whispered, "We're not just disinheriting him, Thane. We're going to dismantle his entire world piece by piece." I sat in the back corner of the cafe, the steam from my tea, the only cloud in a morning of surgical precision, as I prepared to sever the fuel lines to my son's fantasy life. The Riverside Cafe was humming with the low, pleasant drone of neighborhood chatter and the persistent hiss of the espresso machine, but my focus was locked on the scrolling list of names on my laptop screen. I had just come from Patricia Morrison's office with the legal authority to dismantle a wedding that was built on my own impending destruction. By canceling now, I was ensuring the vendors had enough time to stop their labor, but I knew the timing was a fuse. The formal notice of breach letters wouldn't reach Silas until it was far too late for him to find alternative funding. My hands were steady as I picked up my smartphone, the cold metallic feel of the device grounding me in the task. I started with the credit card companies. My first call was to report the identity theft and freeze the 3 fraudulent accounts Silas had opened in my name. I spoke with a clinical detachment that seemed to baffle the agent's practiced empathy. The primary issue is that the trust is compromised. I told her, my voice low and unyielding. Close the accounts. Do not issue replacements. I also canceled the supplementary card Silas had carried for over a decade, his personal piggy bank that I had foolishly replenished without question. "Yes, I understand the policy," I said to the second agent. "My decision is final." One by one, I watched the financial oxygen hiss out of his life. In aerospace, we call this a controlled shutdown. You don't just turn off the engine. You bleed the pressure from the valves until the machine simply stops moving. I could smell the toasted paninis from a nearby table, but my appetite was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating satisfaction. Next, I moved to the vendor list Natalie had so proudly displayed in her glossy binder. I called the wedding planner first, a man named Alessandro, who sounded like he was used to dealing with crises, though not one of this magnitude. "This is Thane Garrison," I said, using my full legal name for the record. "I am the sole financier for the October 25th event. I am withdrawing all funding effective immediately." Alessandro tried to protest, mentioning contracts and commitments, but I followed Patricia's script perfectly. "Please direct any further questions to my attorney, Patricia Morrison." I repeated the process with the florist, the photographer, and the live band. With each call, I discovered a crucial detail. Final payments were due in exactly 10 days. This was the deadline Silas and Natalie were banking on, the moment my money would have been irrevocably committed to their charade. Have you ever felt the weight of a world lifting off your shoulders one phone call at a time? It's the lightest I've felt in years. I felt like a lead mission specialist cleaning up a catastrophic launch failure. Then I reached the bottom of the bag I had searched earlier. I discovered that Silas, in his arrogance, had already signed personal guarantees on several of the largest contracts. He hadn't just used my money. He had legally tethered himself to the debt. It meant that Silas, not I, would be held personally liable for the massive cancellation fees. The trap was now fully calibrated. My final call was to the manager at Sterling Heights Manor. He went silent when I told him the $185,000 deposit was forfeit and the funding was being pulled. I could almost hear the gears of his business mind grinding to a halt. "You realize, sir, they only have 10 days to settle the balance before we lock the gates," he finally said. I stared out at the river, watching a freighter move slowly toward the horizon. I realized I replied. I hung up the phone and closed my laptop, the quiet, professional tone of the last bank agent still echoing in my mind. The structural support for the Ashford Garrison wedding had been removed. I didn't just sign the listing agreement for the Victorian. I felt like I was signing a release valve on 40 years of memories, letting the pressure bleed out before the whole structure could explode. The morning air in Vancouver was crisp, carrying the scent of damp cedar and the promise of a sharp winter. But inside my living room, the atmosphere was sterile. Sarah, a realtor whose sharp bob and aggressive handshake signaled she was the kind of person who could sell ice to an Arctic expedition, looked at my Victorian with the eyes of an appraiser, not a guest. She stood in the center of the hollow echo of the half-packed living room, her tablet glowing as she ran the comparables. I watched the scratch of the pen on the listing agreement with a clinical detachment. The $943,000 endowment I was preparing wasn't just a random number. It was the itemized total of every penny Silas intended to exploit, from me down to the cent, including the projected equity of this very house. I don't want a bidding war, Sarah, I said, my voice steady despite the weight of the moment. I want a closed contract by the end of the week. Price it low enough that a cash buyer won't hesitate. She looked up, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. It's a beautiful home, Thane. You're leaving a lot of money on the table by rushing this. I met her gaze without blinking. I'm not leaving money, Sarah. I'm buying my peace of mind. To me, the house had become a jettisoned spacecraft module, something I had to sacrifice to ensure the survival of the primary mission. In aerospace, you sometimes have to dump the fuel to prevent a crash. My house was the fuel. The foundation was the landing strip. I needed to move fast. If Silas were to check his email or the mail at the Victorian, he might see the first signs of the life support systems failing. But for now, I was still operating in the shadows of his own arrogance. A few days later, I found myself back in the hushed, expensive silence of Patricia Morrison's law office. The smell of fresh ink and expensive office cologne hung in the air as we sat across from that obsidian desk. We were there to finalize the charter for the Katherine Garrison Memorial Scholarship Foundation. I felt a surge of ironic triumph as I reviewed the specific provisions. I had specifically added the Silas Garrison Humility Scholarship, a merit-based award for blue-collar STEM students. It ensured my son's name would be legally tied to the very values of grit and manual labor he had spent his life trying to erase. Have you ever felt more alive while giving everything away? I was technically losing a fortune, but I'd never felt wealthier. I watched the blinding white of the digital bank confirmation on Patricia's screen as I authorized the transfer. The $943,000 vanished from my personal accounts and settled into the foundation's trust. He wanted a legacy of status, Patricia. I said, feeling a resolute chill, I'm giving him a legacy of service. Patricia offered a rare, razor-sharp smile. The transfer is complete, Thane. The foundation is now a legal fortress. She then informed me of a final safeguard. Because the foundation was an irrevocable trust, even if Silas were to win a mental incompetence case later, the law would see the assets as a separate entity. He could never touch a single dollar of it. The cool autumn breeze hit my face as I exited the office building, the taste of lukewarm office water still on my tongue. I checked the calendar on my phone, October 3rd. The 10-day fuse on the wedding vendors was officially lit, and Silas had no idea he was standing on a powder keg. I wasn't in the room to see it, but I could imagine the rhythmic, frantic vibration of Silas's smartphone skittering across his mahogany desk as the first of my mission. Abort sequences reached his perimeter. In the high-rise marketing office where he spent his days crafting illusions of success, the light was bright and clinical, a stark contrast to the shifting shadows of the river I watched from my porch. Silas was likely immersed in a pitch surrounded by the smell of expensive wood and fresh toner, oblivious to the fact that his foundation was currently being dismantled brick by brick. He had recently informed me through a short, sharp email that he was blocking my number entirely to avoid what he called my emotional guilt trips. By doing so, he had effectively cut off his own early warning system. The phone buzzed again, a persistent dull sound against the mahogany. He didn't pick up. He would have seen a series of unknown numbers from the vendors. I had recently canceled the florist, the caterer, the wedding planner, but his arrogance had taught him to view these as mere interruptions. Not now, Alessandro, he likely thought, assuming the wedding planner was merely calling to upsell a premium linens package. He was a man who believed the world existed to serve his momentum, and he wasn't about to let blue-collar logistics ruin his professional flow. In aerospace, there is a phenomenon called target fixation. You become so focused on the landing that you ignore the altimeters screaming that you're out of fuel. Silas was coming in hot, his eyes fixed on the Ashford horizon while his tanks were already bone dry. Between meetings 30 stories above the humming city of Seattle, he finally took a moment to listen to a partial voicemail. It was from the florist, mentioned something about a cancellation and a lack of funding. Silas scoffed, his brain filtering the information through a thick lens of hubris. He didn't see a crisis, he saw a nuisance. My dad probably called them to haggle over the price of lilies again, he muttered to the empty air of his office. It's embarrassing. He didn't bother to verify the data. Instead, he made a quick call to Natalie. She was quick to reinforce his delusion, her voice sharp and dismissive over the speaker. Just ignore them, Silas, she said. My father says vendors always try to create a crisis 10 days out to squeeze the client for more money up front. They're just panicking because they know they're dealing with an Ashford now. Have you ever watched someone walk confidently toward a cliff because they're too busy checking their reflection in the glass? The irony was thick enough to choke on. Natalie, in her own brand of predatory short-sightedness, reminded him that she had encouraged him to sign those personal guarantees on the contracts. She falsely claimed her father would cover any minor discrepancies later, not realizing that those guarantees were now the anchors that would pull Silas under. They basked in a mutual delusion of invincibility, an echo chamber of social climbing that muffled the sound of the approaching storm. Silas felt powerful as he swiped a finger across his cold, smooth smartphone screen, marking the venue manager's third urgent call as spam. He leaned back in his leather chair with a satisfied smirk, feeling like he had successfully managed a difficult situation. He didn't feel the vibration of the next call. He didn't see the red notification that signaled a critical system failure. He sat there, a king in a tower of glass and mahogany, unaware that the padlock on the Sterling Heights gates was already being fitted and the security codes were being reset. I had pulled the fuel lines, and he was still trying to engage the thrusters. The mailman didn't just drop off the envelopes. He required a signature, a physical acknowledgement of the legal landslide I had triggered 10 days ago. I watched from the shadows of my own mind as the scene played out at the entrance of Silas's luxury apartment complex. The heavy thud of a mail truck door closing echoed through the sterile concrete parking garage, a sound of finality that Silas was too distracted to hear. He was currently pacing his marble-tiled foyer, the smell of expensive roast chicken from a delivery bag sitting on the counter competing with the sharp scent of his designer floor wax. He was on the phone with Natalie discussing the seating charts for the private jet that would take the wedding party to the Maldives. When the buzzer rang, he let out a sigh of profound annoyance. The scratch of a ballpoint pen on a delivery slip was the only effort he put into the transaction. The envelope was thick, heavy, and bore the Sterling Heights gold crest on the upper left corner. Silas barely glanced at it. He saw the crest, and his brain, already steeped in a dangerous level of hubris, categorized it immediately. He assumed it was a welcome package, a glossy collection of liability waivers and menu finalizations that he figured I had already dealt with. Just leave it on the counter, he told the delivery man without breaking his stride in his conversation with Natalie. Natalie, babe, don't worry about the caterer. He continued, his voice dripping with a smug negligence. My dad's an engineer. He lives for the details. If there were issues, he would have called. He tossed the certified letter onto a pile of unopened junk mail, a physical manifestation of his refusal to engage with any data that didn't fit his preferred narrative. He was like a pilot who had decided the cockpit alarms were just annoying background noise and reached out to snip the wires. He didn't see the bold red lettering on the interior page that warned of an immediate breach of contract. A few hours later, the digital wall he had built around his life began to show its own structural cracks. Silas opened his laptop, the satisfying click of his mouse, the only sound in his quiet study, as he prepared to do some light social media management. Instead, he found a barrage of emails from the florist and the band, all marked with the subject line, "Urgent payment, overdue." He stared at the screen, but he didn't feel the cold chill of realization. Encouraged by Natalie's earlier advice that vendors used shakedown tactics on high net worth clients, he felt only a surge of indignant anger. "It's a classic high-pressure tactic," he muttered, the bright, mocking blue of the screen reflecting in his narrowed eyes. "They see the Ashford name and think we're a blank check. I'm marking them all as spam. If they want to talk, they can call my dad's lawyer, if he even has one. Have you ever watched someone walk into a trap they set for themselves? While they were laughing at the person who tried to warn them, I watched him through the digital trail I still monitored, seeing him create a custom filter to send any email containing the word payment or cancellation directly to his spam folder. He was laughing at the desperation of the working class, completely unaware that he was deleting his last chance to mitigate the disaster. Natalie, who had arrived to help him pack, watched from the doorway. She admitted then that she'd been deleting the bank notifications on Silas's phone as well. "I wanted to shield you from your father's negativity. Until the wedding is over, babe," she said, her voice a purr of calculated manipulation. "We don't need his drama right now." Silas leaned back, the blue of the spam folder icon glowing like a victory lamp. Silas clicked empty spam folder and watched the digital records of his impending ruin vanish into the ether, a confident smile on his face that I knew would be gone in exactly 8 days. Even the most precise mission specialist needs a second opinion when the cargo he's jettisoning is his own flesh and blood. I pulled my car into the driveway of a modest craftsman, home the kind of place that valued structural integrity over curb appeal. The morning mist was still clinging to the hydrangeas as I stepped out my boots, crunching on the gravel. I needed a moral anchor, and there was only one man who had the blueprints to my character. Tom Brennan, a retired Boeing structural analyst, whose face was as lined and reliable as a well-used topographical map, sat on his porch swing with a glass of iced tea and the patience of a man who'd seen 1,000 test flights fail. He didn't ask why I was there. He just nudged a second wicker chair with his foot and waited for me to find my frequency. I sat down and laid it all out, the flight log of Silas's betrayals, the $89,000 in fraud, and the sickening detail of the guardianship petition. I told him about the Ashford wedding, the filters Silas had set up to block out the truth and the foundation I was building in Catherine's name. "Am I destroying him, Tom?" I asked, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "Or am I just stopping him from destroying me?" Tom took a long, slow sip of his tea, the ice clinking against the glass in a rhythmic, honest tempo. He looked out at the street for a long time before he spoke. "Thane Silas came to see me months ago," he said, and my heart skipped a beat. "He was fishing for information about your private pension details, trying to act like he was doing some financial planning for your future. I didn't tell you because I thought he was just being a fool, but now I see the math." Tom's porch swing creaked with every movement, a rhythmic, honest sound that made Silas's marketing buzzwords feel like cheap plastic. "You're an engineer, Thane. You know when a structure is beyond repair. You don't keep adding weight to a bridge that's already collapsed. You dismantle it before it takes someone else down with it." That relieved solidarity was the fuel I needed to keep the engines running. I left Tom's house with a clearer heading, but the final confirmation was waiting for me back at the Riverside Victorian. The house was half empty now, the rooms echoing with a hollow sound that signaled the end of an era. I made my way to Catherine's sewing room to pack the last of her things. The cold weight of her antique cast-iron singer felt familiar in my hands as I carefully moved it to its transport crate. Behind a roll of dusty batting in the corner of the closet, I found a small, hand-painted wooden sewing box I hadn't seen in years. I sat on the floor, the smell of cedar and old dust filling my lungs. How many times had I walked past that sewing box and missed the very blueprint I needed to navigate this storm? I lifted the lid, sifting through the tangled thread and silver thimbles until my fingers brushed against a yellowed scrap of paper. The rough texture told me of its age before I even saw the ink. It was Catherine's elegant, firm handwriting, a note tucked away as if she knew the family foundation might one day need a retrofit. "Make something beautiful with what you're given," it read. At first, I thought it was just her general philosophy on life, but then I realized the note was wrapped around a spare key to our shared safe deposit box, the one we'd set aside for our 20th anniversary. She had seen the fatigue cracks in Silas even then. She had left me a quiet instruction to use our shared assets for a higher purpose, if the family structure ever failed to hold its own weight. I clutched the scrap of paper to my chest, the words, "Make something beautiful," echoing in the hollow room, and I realized my house wasn't being sold, it was being reborn. The hollow sound of my own footsteps echoed in the empty living room on the morning of the closing, a percussive reminder that the structure I once called home was now officially a box of air and wood. I stood in the center of the space where the oak table had sat for 30 years, the house I had built with my own hands, now looking back at me with the vacant eyes of a stranger. Every stripped wall and empty corner served as a testament to a life I was systematically deconstructing. Mission parameters have changed, I whispered to the silence, feeling the weight of the air change as I moved. It's time to let go of the weight. I had chosen a buyer not for the highest bid, but for the highest integrity. The family moving in was young, struggling, and carried a baby through the threshold, during their final walk through a mirror of what Catherine and I had once been. I knew they would treat the floorboards with the respect of people building an honest life, not as collateral for a social climber's debt. I moved methodically through the rooms, performing a final inspection. In the kitchen, the sunlight hit the spot where I had taught a much smaller Silas how to sear meat without burning the rosemary. In the workshop, the smell of sawdust still lingered, a phantom of the dozens of failed attempts I'd made to spark even a flicker of interest in engineering within my son. I didn't feel the nostalgic agony I expected. I felt the cold, clean efficiency of an engineer jettisoning a module that had served its purpose, but was now a drag on the primary mission. An empty house is just a box of air and wood. The home is the frequency we broadcasted within it, and I was simply changing the channel. I walked out to the garden for the final, most difficult operation. The morning air was damp, and the bright red sold sign stood like a sentinel in the front yard. I knelt in the dirt, the gritty texture of the soil pushing under my fingernails as I began to dig. These weren't just plants. They were Catherine's prized heritage roses. I had to be precise, ensuring the roots remained intact and protected for the move to my new condo balcony. I wasn't leaving her here to be bulldozed for a pool or paved over for a guest house. "You're not staying here, Catherine," I said, the smell of damp earth and rose fertilizer filling my senses as I worked. "We're going where we can grow something new." I felt the sweat on my brow and the physical strain in my lower back, a grounding sensation that the wedding and its hollow status could never provide. Soil under my fingernails, sweat on my brow. This was real. The wedding was a holograph, a projection of a life that didn't actually exist. As I finished loading the last of the root-balled bushes into the back of my car, I noticed a flash of color wedged deep under a porch floorboard near the steps. I reached in and pulled out a final toy car, a battered red Corvette Silas had loved when he was 6. I looked at it for a moment, then set it carefully on the windowsill of the porch for the new family's child to find. I was fully severing the sentimental tether. I climbed into the driver's seat, the cold click of the car door, locking echoing in the quiet street. I pulled the gear shift into drive without looking back at the sold sign, the scent of damp earth and heritage roses filling the car as I headed toward a city that didn't know I was coming. The scent of damp earth and heritage roses still clung to my jacket as I pulled the car away from the empty lot of my former life. I didn't look back at the sold sign. My destination was the Riverside Roastery, a place that had become my mobile command center during this deconstruction. I was staring at the final clause of the scholarship charter, the cold, dry texture of the legal brochure, a grounding weight in my hand when the sharp, arrogant click of $1,000 loafers announced that the second half of the infection had just walked through the door. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. The sharp smell of expensive, overbearing espresso and a hint of sandalwood cologne preceded him. Richard Ashford, a man whose tailored charcoal suit and predator's grin signaled he was the kind of tech mogul who viewed empathy as a bug in the code rather than a feature. pulled out the chair opposite me without waiting for an invitation. "You must be the engineer," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "Silas speaks." "Well, he speaks of your hard work." I finally looked up, meeting his gaze with the same clinical detachment I used to analyze a stress fracture in a turbine blade. "I'm sure he does, Richard," I replied, my voice level. "He's always been good with a narrative." I watched the glint of a gold signet ring as he adjusted his cuffs. He was under the impression that I was still the silent financier, the passive engine pushing his daughter's social aspirations toward the finish line. I decided to treat this as a final flight test. I wanted to see if the in-laws were victims of Silas's deception, or if they were the architects of it. He spoke about my life like it was a spent booster rocket, something to be dropped and burned up in the atmosphere once it had pushed the payload high enough. Richard laughed a hollow sound that lacked any genuine warmth. He leaned in, sipping a drink that smelled of burnt beans and vanity. "I have to say, Thane, I admire what Silas did with those credit lines. OPM, other people's money, is the cornerstone of high-stakes business. The boy knows how to use his assets. You should be proud." The realization hit me with the force of a high-velocity impact. Richard Ashford didn't just know about the identity theft. He viewed it as a trial run for the ruthlessness needed in their social circle. "So you consider my life savings just leverage?" I asked, the taste of my bitter, oversteeped tea matching the mood. Richard shrugged, indifferent to the moral friction. "In our world, leverage is everything. If you aren't using the resources available to you, you aren't trying. Silas is showing initiative. He's grooming himself for the Ashford board. How do you fight an enemy that views your basic decency as a structural flaw?" I realized then that Silas hadn't just stumbled into greed. He was being carefully shaped by the very empire he was trying to join. He was a student of Richard's philosophy of exploitation. Richard checked his own watch, a gold-rimmed monstrosity, and stood up. He seemed to think he was bestowing a blessing on a subordinate. "Just make sure the liquidation of that Victorian house goes through by Friday," he said, his predator's grin widening. "Silas needs that capital to finalize the down payment on the lakefront estate. That's why I promised him the Patek Philippe watch. It wasn't a gift, Thane. It was a performance bonus contingent on him successfully clearing out your old assets." He looked down at me, the glint of his signet ring catching the overhead lights. Richard stood up, adjusting his silk tie with a smile that never reached his predatory eyes. And I realized I wasn't just canceling a wedding. I was cutting out a cancer that had already metastasized. The Ashford world didn't value history or home or honesty. They valued the burn rate of other people's lives. I sat in silence as he walked away, his expensive shoes clicking with a sound like a ticking clock, and I felt my resolve harden into tempered steel. The demolition was no longer just necessary. It was a service to the world. The sprawling, hopeful energy of the University of Washington campus was a stark contrast to the stagnant, expensive rot I just left behind at the coffee shop. I walked along the brick pathways, the bright, unyielding October sun casting long shadows that stretched toward the future rather than the past. The sound of many students' footsteps on concrete created a rhythmic cadence that felt alive and purposeful. I was looking for the engineering building, specifically the scholarship committee office, but I found myself pausing near a construction site for a new lab annex. I stood there, leaning against a cold concrete pillar, clutching a simple university-branded bottled water. I was watching a young woman who wasn't just walking by. She was standing near the site perimeter, her eyes locked on the structural lintel being hoisted by a crane. Elena Rodriguez, 19 and possessing a gaze that held the quiet intensity of a blueprint coming to life, wiped her hands on a custodial rag and looked at the site with more reverence than Natalie ever showed my home. She wore rough custodial work gloves and a university-issued jumpsuit, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. "You look like you're calculating the load-bearing capacity of that lintel young lady," I said, my voice carrying a warmth I hadn't felt in weeks. She jumped slightly, then offered a shy, intelligent smile. "I'm trying to figure out how to make it more sustainable, sir. My dad says bridges shouldn't just connect roads. They should connect people." I felt a jolt of recognition. It turned out she was an engineering student herself, currently working as a campus custodian to pay for the books her tuition didn't cover. Elena began talking about her passion for structural integrity, and my heart skipped a beat when she cited one of my old wing load papers from my Boeing days as the reason she chose this field. Meeting her was like seeing a prototype that actually worked. No marketing buzz, no image-centric gloss, just pure high-tensile potential. We sat on a nearby stone bench in the courtyard, the smell of fall leaves and campus coffee drifting on the breeze. Elena shared her struggles with a quiet dignity. She was working 2 jobs supporting her younger siblings and living in constant fear that a single missed tuition payment or a broken-down car would end her dream. I listened with an engineer's focus, realizing she was the living embodiment of the legacy Catherine wanted for our name. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly as she looked at her rough work gloves. If someone like me is even supposed to be here. I leaned in my resolve, hardening into something unbreakable. Let me tell you something, Elena. The strongest structures aren't made of gold or expensive suits. They're made of the will to hold everything else up. You belong here more than anyone I've met in years. How had I spent so many years funding a black hole like Silas? When stars like this were struggling for air, the math was simple, yet devastating. Every dollar Silas had stolen or intended to waste on a 6-hour vanity project could have funded 5 more students like Elena. I decided right there, sitting in that courtyard, to double the initial scholarship endowment. I didn't tell her who I was or that I was about to change her life forever. I just watched her stand up, tucking her custodial rag into her pocket. She had a lecture to attend, and I had a legacy to finalize. I watched her walk toward the library, a worn textbook under her arm and a future in her eyes, and I knew that in 6 days the explosion I'd planned wouldn't just be an end, it would be a birth. The why behind the destruction of Silas's world was no longer an abstract concept. It had a name and a face. I walked toward the administration building, my footsteps heavy with the weight of a billion-dollar responsibility, but my heart was finally mercifully at peace. I didn't carry the keys to my new life in a velvet box. I carried them in a cardboard box, labeled Miscellaneous, the industrial tape screaming as I sliced it open to let the past breathe. Arriving at the new condo was a tactical maneuver, not a relocation. Thane Garrison stood in the center of a modest 2-bedroom space, near the University of Washington, surrounded by the smell of cedar chips and fresh paint. My hands, still slightly gritty from the morning's work, felt the weight of the transition. I unpacked Catherine's sewing machine, first lifting the cast-iron frame with a grunt of exertion. I placed it by the east-facing window, ensuring it would catch the same morning light that used to illuminate her sewing room in the old Victorian. Smaller footprint, Catherine, I whispered to the empty air. Less drag. Just the way we planned our first engine. I began to arrange my life with the same methodical precision I once used to calculate airframe stress. This wasn't a retreat. It was a tactical consolidation. I checked my phone and saw a final blinking notification from Silas. I hit play, expecting another insult, but instead I heard his voice sounding sharp and entitled. Dad, why is the house alarm beeping? And why did the security company say my code is invalid? Fix it now. I have movers coming by for my storage bins. I deleted the message without a word. He didn't even know the locks had been changed by the young family who now owned the deed. He was trying to navigate a blueprint that no longer existed. Moving is like jettisoning a heavy atmosphere. Suddenly you can see the stars, but the cold is more biting than you expected. I sat at a small clean table and performed my final pre-flight check. The irrevocable truss was locked tight, the foundation was chartered, with the full $943,000, and the vendor cancellations were legally binding. I felt a strange clinical calm as I took out a new calendar and circled October 25th in heavy red ink. Reckoning day, fuel lines cut, control surfaces locked. Now we wait for impact. I spent the next few days in a state of suspended animation, moving through the condo like a ghost in a new machine. On the eve of the wedding, I drove out to the Vancouver City Cemetery. The air was dry and smelled of cold stone and dying leaves as I walked toward Catherine's plot. The sun was bleeding over the river, a bruised purple and orange that felt appropriate for the occasion. I reached her headstone and knelt, my fingers tracing the cold granite. Have you ever apologized to a gravestone for the living? It's a conversation that requires more honesty than most people can handle. I told her everything: Silas's theft, the guardianship petition, and the fact that I was about to incinerate the only world our son understood. He's not the boy we raised anymore, Catherine, I said, my voice finally breaking in the quiet of the graveyard. He's a structural failure I can't patch. I'm not destroying him. I'm releasing a parasite to face the reality of the world he chose. As I stood up to leave, I noticed something jarring. Tucked against the base of the stone was a fresh bouquet of cheap, store-bought carnations. I reached down and found a small card signed by Natalie. I didn't feel touched. I felt a chill of revulsion. I realized she wasn't there to pay respects. She was checking the grave, looking for signs of recent visits, to see if I was vulnerable enough to manipulate one last time before the ceremony. It was a reconnaissance mission disguised as grief. I walked away from the grave as the first frost of autumn crunched under my boots, leaving behind the weight of the garrison name and heading toward a dawn that would burn my son's world to the ground. October the 25th arrived with the clinical chill of a winter launch. The sun barely cresting the Seattle skyline as I poured my coffee and waited for the first structural failure to report in. I sat in my new condo, the space smelling of fresh roast and the faint lingering scent of damp earth from the roses I had watered on the balcony at dawn. My morning routine was a study in eerie serenity, a stark contrast to the tactical demolition I had initiated weeks ago. I checked the time on my old Hamilton watch. T-minus 90 minutes. The air's clear, Catherine. The trajectory is set. I felt a strange, quiet satisfaction knowing that while I found peace in this modest square footage, Silas was currently drowning in the frantic, expensive chaos of the Pinnacle Grand Suite. I had taken the final precaution of setting my phone to auto-reply to block numbers with a link to the Foundation's mission page. It was a digital breadcrumb for a man who was about to find himself starving for answers. I knew Silas and Natalie would be at the peak of their delusion by now, draped in silk and surrounding themselves with the superficial armor of high society stylists. My phone remained silent, a vacuum of sound that I had intentionally created by blocking the only people who would currently be screaming for my help. Silas was a man standing on a glass floor looking at the view, while the support struts were being unscrewed one by the very man who built them. High above the city in the hotel's royal suite, Silas likely adjusted his bow tie in a mirror that reflected a version of himself he hadn't yet realized was a fiction. The room was thick with the scent of expensive hairspray and lilies, the air vibrating with the laughter of groomsmen and the clinking of mimosa glasses. To the Ashfords, Silas toasted his voice, reaching through the double doors to where Natalie was being pinned into her gown. May their pockets be deep and their inheritance be soon. Natalie laughed, the sound muffled by the stylist working on her veil. Check your phone, Silas, she called out. Make sure the venue is ready for the floral drop-off. I want those orchids perfect. Silas picked up his smartphone, the cold vibration of the device against his palm, signaling an incoming call from an unknown number. He assumed it was the venue manager confirming the vintage of the champagne or a late-arriving guest. He swiped to answer with a jovial, expansive tone. Hello, yes, this is Silas Garrison. I'm quite busy, so unless this is about the seating. His smile vanished as a woman's voice, sharp and professional, cut through his arrogance. It was Annette from La Fleur Boutique. She wasn't calling to confirm the orchids. She was calling to inform him that the entire $38,000 order had been canceled weeks ago. There was no truck. There were no flowers. Wait, what do you mean? Canceled? Silas stammered, his face losing its mimosa-fueled flush. There must be a mistake. My father is paying for this. Check the records again. Silence. Then a dial tone. The first support beam had just snapped. Silas stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear, as the groomsmen's laughter became a dissonant background noise. He realized then that because he had blocked my calls weeks ago to avoid my emotional guilt trips, he had missed the specific final chance call I had made before the legal fuse was lit. He had blinded himself to the warning lights, and now the cockpit was starting to fill with smoke. He tried to redial, but his fingers were clumsy, shaking with the first tremors of a panic he couldn't name. Natalie appeared in the doorway, her gown a shimmering white cloud, her expression shifting as she saw the look on his face. Silas. What's wrong? Why are you white as a sheet? Silas didn't answer. He couldn't. He dropped the mimosa glass, the sound of it shattering on the marble floor like a gunshot. The bright orange liquid spread across the white hotel rug like a fresh wound. Before he could speak, his phone began to vibrate again. This time it was the photographer. The second vibration didn't just rattle the nightstand. It sounded like the death rattle of Silas's social ambition. As the photographer delivered a blow, even Natalie's arrogance couldn't deflect. Silas clutched the phone, his knuckles white, as he listened to Mark, the photographer he had personally vetted for the Ashford aesthetic. The groomsmen had gone silent, their half-finished mimosas looking like stagnant water in the heavy air. I don't care what your father said, Silas. Mark's voice was blunt, leaking through the speaker for everyone to hear. No money, no photos. We're out. My crew is already loading the van. Silas tried to speak, but his voice was a thin, dry rasp. Mark, wait. Before he could finish, a notification pinged on his screen from the limo company. He stared at it, his eyes widening in a mask of escalating dread. The entire fleet had been recalled. The app screen was cold and final booking, canceled by financier. Natalie's bridesmaids stood in the connecting doorway, their silk robes shimmering under the clinical hotel lights, their faces pale as they witnessed the collapse in real time. Silas began to pace, the smell of expensive foundation and sweat filling the small space. He was a man drowning in a high-altitude flight without oxygen, finally feeling the reality of the thin air. He scrambled to his laptop, his fingers trembling as he navigated to his inbox. He finally opened an email he'd been ignoring for 2 days, one buried under the filters he'd so arrogantly created. It was a formal legal notice of contract termination. The document was signed by my attorney, Patricia Morrison, but the authority behind it was mine. I had coordinated every move with a clinical engineering precision that Silas never expected. Natalie snatched the phone from his hand, her perfectly applied makeup beginning to look like a mask of fury. This isn't happening, she screamed, her voice hitting a pitch that made the stylists awkwardly begin packing their kits. He can't do this. We have a signed agreement. She didn't understand that I hadn't just stopped the checks. I had dismantled the legal framework they were standing on. Silas realized with a sickening thud in his chest that the spam folder he had so confidently emptied just yesterday had contained every single legal warning and vendor plea. He had literally deleted his own safety net. Natalie didn't wait for him to find his breath. She hit the speed dial for Alessandro, the wedding planner, screaming for an explanation. The sound of the phone ringing was shrill and repetitive, a countdown to their social execution. Alessandro's response was ice cold, his voice carrying the weight of weeks of ignored warnings. I tried to fix this a month ago, Natalie, he said, and the silence in the room was absolute. You had security escort me out, and you blocked my calls. Your father-in-law pulled the plug while you were too busy laughing at his blue-collar shoes. The venue is locked. The vendors are gone. Goodbye. Have you ever heard the sound of someone's future being deleted in real time? It sounds exactly like the busy signal that followed. Silas felt the taste of dry, metallic panic in his throat. He looked at Natalie, hoping for a shred of the Ashford power to save them, but he found a different kind of betrayal. Natalie admitted through gritted teeth that her father had stopped covering their side of the costs weeks ago, expecting me to be the blank check for the entire production. They were two predators who had accidentally tried to eat each other. Natalie dropped the phone onto the rug, her eyes wide with genuine terror, as she whispered the one thing Silas never thought he'd hear. They locked the gates, Silas. They actually locked us out. The crunch of gravel under the limo tires sounded like bone being crushed, a final rhythmic warning before we hit the literal and metaphorical wall of my son's social extinction. The limousine came to a screeching halt before the massive wrought iron gates of Sterling Heights Manor. Silas and Natalie disheveled and frantic stared through the glass at an entrance that was unmistakably chained and padlocked. A professionally printed sign hung from the bars, stating in clear clinical font that the event was canceled per the financier's request. Silas lunged out of the car, his expensive tuxedo jacket snagging on the doorframe. "Open the gate! This is my wedding day!" he screamed, his voice cracking as he rattled the heavy chains. The metallic rattle of the padlocks was the only response. Guests in the trailing cars began to pull over tires, screeching on the narrow road as a bottleneck of confusion formed. Natalie stepped out beside him, her gown already smeared with the bitter taste of dust in the air. "Look at the sign, Silas," she whispered, her face ashen. "It says canceled. Your father actually did it." Silas turned to the crowd of prying eyes, his pride bleeding out in front of his peers. "It's a mistake," he shouted to anyone listening. "My father has had a breakdown. He has dementia. He doesn't know what he's doing." Just as the lie left his lips, the venue manager stepped toward the gate from the inside. He didn't open it. He simply stood behind the bars and announced to the growing crowd that the cancellation had been vetted and finalized by a top-tier law firm weeks ago. The Ashford social standing was a dirigible made of silk and hot air. I hadn't just popped it, I'd ignited the hydrogen. Richard and Vanessa Ashford, 60 and possessing the ice water in veins poise of a woman who had never known a day without a silver spoon, stepped out of the second limousine. Vanessa looked at the padlocked gates with the same disgust she would a cockroach in her kitchen. The smell of expensive perfume began to mix with car exhaust and the heat of rising tempers. Richard's face turned a shade of purple that I had never seen his tech titan composure shattering in the face of such a high-profile fiasco. "You told me this was handled," Richard roared, stepping into Silas's space. "You assured me he was too weak to pull the plug. You told me the Garrison name meant something in this state." Silas backpedaled, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of supplication. "Richard, please, it's my father, the dementia, the doctors. The only breakdown here is your credibility." "Silas," Richard snapped, his voice a whip crack that silenced the murmuring guests. "We are done." I watched the scene unfold from a distance, or rather through the lens I'd provided. I had hired a local social media influencer to be among the guests, ensuring the blinding glare of smartphone screens recording the chaos would broadcast this humiliation live to the very circles Silas desperately wanted to impress. Have you ever watched a man realize his mask is made of paper while it's starting to rain? It's a terrifying kind of clarity. Silas looked around and saw not friends or family, but a wall of glowing rectangles, each one a nail in the coffin of his manufactured identity. He had spent years building a holograph of success, and I had simply turned off the projector. Natalie was sobbing now, her mascara running in black streaks down her face, but Vanessa Ashford didn't move to comfort her daughter. She merely adjusted her pearls and looked at Silas with a lethal, silent judgment. Richard Ashford turned his back on my sobbing son, his voice as cold as a morgue slab. Vanessa called the driver. "We're going to that old man's house to find out what he did with our investment." Silas didn't even wait for the limo to come to a full stop before he was out the door, his tuxedo jacket flapping like the broken wings of a bird that had just realized the sky was falling. The screech of brakes tore through the quiet air of my old neighborhood, a jagged sound that scattered the crows from the maples. I wasn't there to see it, but I could envision the heat radiating from the black limousines as they idled in front of the Riverside Victorian. Silas charged up the walkway, kicking up the dry autumn leaves I used to rake with such care. He was a man possessed a storm of silk and desperation, but he was stopped mid-stride by a bright, mocking red sold sign staked firmly into the grass. He stared at it for a heartbeat, the color of the sign reflecting in his wide, bloodshot eyes like a warning light. He lunged for the porch, fishing his key from his pocket with shaking hands and shoving it into the lock. The cylinder wouldn't budge. He tried again, twisting with enough force to snap the metal, but the results were the same. The locks had been changed. He began to pound on the solid oak door, the hollow thud echoing through a house that no longer belonged to our name. "Dad, open this door. I know you're in there." Silas screamed, his voice reaching a pitch of pure, unadulterated panic. Natalie and the Ashfords followed more slowly, their expensive shoes clicking on the pavement like a funeral march. Natalie stopped at the base of the steps, her gaze fixed on the date on the sign. Silas, the sign. It says closed on the 15th. He sold it. He actually sold our house. Silas realized then that by selling the house as is for cash, I had bypassed the standard 30-day closing period. I had left him with zero legal time to file an injunction or claim a stake in the equity. The house wasn't just empty, it was a vacuum. It had sucked out the last of Silas's leverage and left him gasping in the driveway. The cold wind blowing off the Columbia River bit through their wedding attire, but the chill was nothing compared to the silence coming from behind those windows. Bimbi Mrs. Gable, the neighbor who had watched me grow my roses for 30 years, stood on her porch with her arms crossed, her eyes holding the sharp judgment of a woman who knew exactly which garrison was the one of value. She watched them with a clinical detachment that mirrored my own. "Where is he?" Silas roared, turning on her with a wild look. "Tell me where the old man went." Mrs. Gable didn't flinch. "He moved out 2 weeks ago, young man." He looked like a man who just put down a heavy suitcase, more peaceful than I'd seen him in years. He mentioned he was heading toward a new beginning where merit outweighed status. A young couple with a newborn has already taken possession. I suggest you get off their property before they call the police. Silas collapsed onto the porch steps, the breath leaving him in a long, shuddering hiss. Have you ever seen a man realize he's been evicted from his own father's future? It's a silence that screams louder than any tantrum. Richard Ashford stood by the limo, his face a mask of cold, calculating fury. He wasn't looking at Silas with pity. He was looking at a failed investment. Natalie, however, was already on her phone, her fingers flying across the screen with a predatory speed. I had anticipated this move. I deliberately left my forwarding address in the public property tax records, a digital breadcrumb designed to lead them to the final reckoning. I didn't want to hide. I wanted them to see exactly what I had built, with the ruins of their greed. "I found it," Natalie whispered, her voice trembling. "He didn't hide it. He's in a condo near the university." Silas looked up from his phone, his eyes bloodshot and predatory. "Unit 2. B, driver, get back in the car. We're finishing this now." I didn't bolt the door. I left it slightly ajar, listening to the frantic, heavy rhythm of Silas's expensive shoes pounding up the hallway like the drums of a war he'd already lost. I sat at my new dining table, a modest piece that felt more solid than the illusions Silas had been building for months. The muted, peaceful sounds of a Sunday afternoon in the university district were shattered by the roar of 2 limousines, their engines groaning as they idled at the curb below. I felt the bitter, dry taste of adrenaline coat the back of my throat, but my hands remained steady as I poured a cup of tea. Silas burst into the condo, his ruined tuxedo collar frayed and stained with sweat. Behind him, Natalie followed like a seething shadow, her face a mask of calculated fury, while Richard and Vanessa Ashford trailed in with ashen, hollow expressions. "You've lost your mind." Silas screamed, his voice cracking as he lunged into the center of my small living room. "You sold my house. You canceled my life. You think you can just walk away from everything we built? I didn't even stand up." I watched him with the detached precision of a safety inspector watching a structural failure reach its terminal velocity. "I didn't sell your house, Silas," I said, my voice echoing the clinical calm of my study. "I sold mine, and I didn't cancel your life. I just stopped subsidizing the lie." I noticed the small green light of the hidden camera I'd installed in the bookshelf, a silent witness to his escalating tirade. Everything he said, every threat he spat, was being recorded for the police. He was screaming about loyalty while standing on a floor he'd personally hollowed out with a saw. "Gravity doesn't care about your excuses, and neither do I." Silas continued to pace, the smell of stale hotel champagne and sweat following him like a physical rot. Natalie stepped forward, her signet ring glinting as she pointed a finger at me. "You have no right to do this. Thane, we have legal standing." I slowly reached for a manila folder sitting on the table, the sharp rustle of legal-sized paper, The only sound in the room, as Silas's shouting died down into a ragged breathing. If you're still here with me, leave a quick comment so I know you're still following this story. Just type the number 7 in the comments so I know you're still here. And before we continue, a quick note: the next part includes a few fictionalized details added to enrich the storytelling. If that's not something you'd like to hear, you're free to stop the video here. I laid out the logs of Silas's identity theft. First, the $89,000 in fraudulent charges documented with an engineer's attention to detail. Then I placed the most damning piece in the center of the table, the draft of the guardianship petition Silas had forgotten in his leather bag. The room went deadly quiet, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of a small clock on the mantel. "This is the petition you drafted to have me committed," I said, looking directly into my son's bloodshot eyes. "I believe you called it taking out the trash." Silas's gray, hollow terror was visible as he stared at the blinding white paper. I can explain that he stammered, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the back of a chair. "It was for your own protection. You weren't thinking clearly." Richard Ashford stepped forward not to defend Silas, but to examine the evidence of the fraud. "Do you know what it feels like to show a man his own soul and watch him try to look away? It's the quietest sound in the world." I watched Silas's face transition from rage to a broken, empty realization as I slid the final set of papers across the table. These weren't about money. They were the printed text logs of Natalie's affair with Tyler Ashford exchanges that detailed their plan to secure the Garrison inheritance before discarding Silas like a spent booster rocket. Silas reached for the photos of Natalie and Tyler, his hands shaking so violently the paper rattled like dry leaves as Richard Ashford stepped forward not to defend Silas, but to examine the evidence of his own family's betrayal. Watching Silas try to cry was like watching a bad actor audition for a part he didn't realize had already been cut from the script. The sound of his breathing, ragged, uneven, and utterly defeated, filled the small condo, but the resonance was wrong. It lacked the frequency of genuine grief. Silas dropped to his knees on my new rug, his hands reaching out in a gesture of supplication that felt as rehearsed as a corporate apology. "I did it for us, Dad." He wailed, the scent of expensive floor wax and his stale cologne thick in the air. "I was terrified of losing you like we lost Mom. The guardianship was just a safeguard for your future medical needs. I couldn't stand the thought of you being alone and confused." I watched him with an engineer's detachment, recognizing the same manipulative frequencies he had used since he was 10 years old to avoid a grounding. "You weren't terrified of losing me, Silas," I said, my voice as cold and level as a winter horizon. "You were terrified of losing the lifestyle I was paying for. You saw a support structure and decided to strip it for parts, while the building was still occupied. He was a sinking ship trying to use the water he'd taken on to douse a fire he'd started himself. It was a failure of logic so profound it was almost pathetic." Natalie stood behind him, her eyes darting around the room, looking for a way to pivot the narrative. She thought she could still find a flaw in the design. I noticed her hand slipping into her designer clutch, her thumb moving with a specific rhythmic intent. She was attempting to discreetly activate a recording on her phone, hoping to goad me into an admission of malicious intent, or perhaps a slip of memory that would validate their senility claim. I reached over and tapped a small, inconspicuous black box on the bookshelf. A blue flicker appeared on its surface, my condo's own signal jammer and high-definition security system. "I've been recording since the moment you breached the threshold, Natalie," I said. "Your phone is a brick in this room, and every movement you've made, including that attempt to fabricate evidence, is now on a secure cloud server managed by Patricia Morrison." Richard Ashford, who had been standing by the window like a gargoyle carved from charcoal silk, finally moved. He looked at his daughter, then at the broken man on the floor, and I saw the moment he performed a total asset extraction of his own. "Quiet, Natalie," he snapped. "You've humiliated this family enough. Get in the car. Ever seen a house of cards fall? It doesn't make a sound. It just stops being a house." Richard and Vanessa turned their backs on the wreckage of the wedding, their departure marked by the sound of a limo door slamming with finality from the street below. The audience was gone and the performance ended instantly. Silas's tears stopped the moment the Ashford shadow left the hallway. He stood up, smoothing his tuxedo with a cold, snarling resentment that was far more honest than his sobbing. "You think you won?" He spat his eyes, finally dry and hard. "You're just a lonely old man in a box." I leaned back, feeling the coldness of the door handle in my hand as I prepared to end the encounter. Actually, Silas, the Catherine Garrison Memorial Foundation, is already fully operational, but I added a specific clause to the endowment charter. It includes a recovery of funds provision. Every penny you stole through those fraudulent cards is now a legal debt to the foundation. We will be seeking repayment from your future earnings for the rest of your life. It's a structural realignment, son. You're going to fund the education of students who actually value hard work. I stood in the doorway as the last Ashford limousine pulled away, leaving Silas standing on the sidewalk in a tuxedo he couldn't afford, clutching a phone that would never ring with an Ashford's voice again. I closed the door, the click of the lock sounding like the final bolt on a secure vault. I didn't need to see the bank notification to know the trap had sprung. The desperate, frantic way Silas began clawing at his phone on the sidewalk told me the forged wire transfer had finally hit the digital wall. I stood at my second-story window, partially shielded by the curtain, watching my son descend into a state of frantic helplessness. The sun reflected off his smartphone screen with a blinding glare as he jabbed at the glass. He had discovered a pre-saved wire transfer template on his laptop earlier, a bait I had intentionally left visible, knowing he would reach for any Hail Mary once the Ashfords abandoned him. The account showed a balance that made his breath catch $400,000, the exact amount of the wedding budget he believed had been stolen from him, now sitting in what appeared to be an accessible foundation account. It's just a signature he probably muttered to the hot asphalt and city exhaust. It's my name too. It's practically my money anyway, the full $400,000, everything he was owed, everything he deserved. He had attempted to authorize a $400,000 wire transfer, the entire foundation balance, using a forged digital signature. Instead of a confirmation, his screen was now flashing a pulsating red notification. Access denied. Account under forensic audit. He looked like a man trying to repair a high-voltage line with a pair of kitchen scissors. The sparks were inevitable. The smell of burning was just the data following the physics. He began to pace a tight, jagged circle on the sidewalk, his expensive tuxedo now a straitjacket of his own making. He tried to storm back toward the building entrance, likely intending to scream at me through the intercom, but a black sedan pulled smoothly to the curb, blocking his path. Patricia Morrison stepped out, the sharp click of her briefcase opening, sounding like a hammer cocking in the quiet afternoon. Silas froze, the red text of the forensic audit still glowing on his phone. "Forgery is a Class C felony, mister." Garrison Patricia said, her voice cutting through the hum of the city like a diamond on glass. "And you just did it, in real time, while being monitored." Silas looked at her, then up at my window, his face a mask of cold terror. "What do you want?" he croaked. "What does he want from me?" Patricia didn't blink. She held out a formal notice of criminal referral, detailing the specific evidence of the $400,000 forged wire transfer he had attempted only minutes ago. "My father has already provided a sworn statement," she explained, the sound of her voice steady and clinical. "The only reason the police aren't here yet is because of a very specific set of conditions. Have you ever seen someone realize the exit they've been running toward is actually the door to a furnace?" Silas began to tremble, the reality of a prison cell finally outweighing the fantasy of a trust fund. The conditions were simple but absolute. Patricia pulled a final document from her briefcase, the paper crisp and white against the dark leather. "You will sign a total waiver of all future inheritance claims," she stated. "You will also agree to a permanent restraining order. In exchange, my father will withhold the forensic evidence from the district attorney." It was a total power reversal. My son was no longer a predator. He was a liability being liquidated. Patricia held out the pen, its silver barrel glinting in the harsh afternoon light, and I watched my son's hand tremble as he realized he was about to sign away the only thing he ever truly valued, my death. He looked at the legal clipboard, the scratch of the pen against the paper, the only thing left of his future. He wasn't just signing a waiver, he was signing a confession that his greed had finally outrun his intellect. I let the curtain fall back into place, the room behind me, silent and perfectly synchronized, with the ticking of the Hamilton on my wrist. I watched the ink dry on Silas's disinheritance with the same cold satisfaction an engineer feels when a faulty support beam is finally removed from a blueprint. Outside on the sidewalk, the scratch of the pen against the paper was a small sound, but it carried the weight of a final structural collapse. Silas signed the waiver under Patricia's watchful eye, his face a gray mask of defeat, as he officially severed his legal ties to the Garrison estate. He wasn't just signing away money, he was signing away his leverage, his identity, and the very foundation of the lies he'd told the Ashfords. Natalie watched from the lobby, shadow her eyes cold and calculating, already distancing herself from the wreckage. Patricia clicked her pen, collected the documents, and gave me a sharp professional nod before walking toward her sedan. "It's done, mister. Garrison," she said, her voice cutting through the humid afternoon air. "He's legally a ghost to you now." I stood in the doorway, the cold draft from the hallway hitting my back. "Good," I replied. "Let the ghosts haunt their own graveyards." I began to retreat into my condo, but before I could lock the door, Natalie slipped into the foyer. She hadn't witnessed the signing on the sidewalk. She'd been in the lobby, already calculating her next move. Her designer heels clicked with a new predatory rhythm on the tile. She had dropped the hysterical bride act entirely. Now she possessed the chillingly professional tone of a liquidator. She didn't look at Silas, who remained slumped on the sidewalk, seemingly waiting for a pity he would never receive. She didn't know that I could see Silas's trembling hands through the door crack, as he stood up and followed her in silence, hovering just outside the ajar door. She wasn't a partner. She was a parasite that had realized its host was dead, and was now looking to negotiate terms with the next body in line. "We both know Silas is a weak-link Thane," she said, her voice dropping to a low melodic purr. She smelled of expensive, suffocating perfume that seemed to fill the small foyer like a fog. "I can handle him. I can keep him away from you and the estate permanently, but a woman in my position needs insurance." She revealed then that she had her own recording of Silas's identity theft confession, a secret weapon she'd intended to use as leverage against him, if the marriage ever soured. I felt a surge of moral revulsion that tasted like bitter coffee and disgust. "You're proposing I pay you to keep my own son away?" I asked, watching her eyes sparkle with a predatory hunger. "You really are an Ashford through and through." Natalie leaned in, oblivious to the shadow behind her. "Silas is a useless, incompetent toy Thane. He's served his purpose. Give me a private settlement, and you'll never see either of us again. Have you ever seen a person's entire world collapse twice in one afternoon? It makes a very specific kind of silence. It's the silence of a vacuum." I looked past her shoulder as the door creaked open further. Silas stood there, his face as white as his ruined wedding shirt, staring at the woman he'd destroyed his father to please. He had heard every word. He had heard her describe him as a broken tool to be traded for a check. Natalie leaned in, her perfume cloying and sweet, just as the door creaked open to reveal Silas, his face as white as his ruined wedding shirt, staring at the woman he'd destroyed, his father, to please. I didn't need to say a word. The look on Silas's face as he realized his soulmate was negotiating his price, like a piece of salvaged scrap metal, did all the heavy lifting for me. The last lie he believed in finally shattered, leaving him raw and exposed in the middle of my foyer. Natalie didn't even flinch. She simply adjusted her clutch, her eyes fixed on me, waiting for a counteroffer that would never come. In a fit of nihilistic rage, Silas lunged past her toward my dining table. "If I'm going down, I'm taking everything you built with me," he roared, his voice cracking with the strain of his own collapse. He snatched my laptop, which I had intentionally left open with a high-level administrative override active. He thought he was stealing the access keys to the Garrison Trust, a desperate grab for the digital lifeblood he felt entitled to. "Go ahead, Silas," I said, my voice as steady as a structural beam. "Take it. It's exactly what you've been doing for months." I watched with clinical detachment as he pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner to authorize what he thought was a total account drain. He didn't hear the sharp electronic chirp of the honeypot alarm I'd hidden in the software. The laptop wasn't a vault. It was a tethered terminal specifically set up to transmit his unique biometric thumbprint as authorization for a final undeniable felony. Justice isn't a hammer. It's a series of interlocking gears. Once the first tooth catches, the rest of the machine takes care of the demolition. Silas stared at the screen, expecting a confirmation of his theft. But the condo was suddenly flooded with the smell of ozone and the cold reality of a trap. Before I reveal the federal authority that was waiting just outside that door, are you still with me? Comment 1 if you think Natalie is the true villain here too, if Silas is solely responsible for his own fall, and tell me why. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes. The purpose is reflection and learning. The door didn't just open, it was breached with a heavy professional force. Special Agent Vance, a man with the weary eyes of a federal investigator who had seen too many rich kids throw their lives away for a shortcut, stepped into the foyer. He held a warrant that looked like a death certificate for Silas's career. Silas Garrison, you are under arrest for wire fraud and unauthorized access to a protected computer. Vance announced, his voice devoid of emotion. Behind him, 2 other agents moved in with a practiced lethal efficiency. Natalie tried to back away, her face pale, as she realized the clinical environment of the condo had become a federal crime scene. Natalie, tell them. Silas screamed as the cold metallic click of handcuffs echoed against the walls. Tell them it was all him. He's crazy. He's senile. Natalie didn't say a word. She watched him being pinned against the wall, with the same indifference she'd shown my old Victorian. Handcuffs make a very specific sound. It's the sound of a story reaching its final period. But Agent Vance wasn't finished. He turned to Natalie, holding out a second dry paper-white warrant. Natalie Ashford, you are also under arrest. We've been monitoring your communications for months regarding corporate espionage against Ashford Tech. It seems Silas was merely your unwitting fall guy for the data breaches. The irony was a perfect circle. My son had sold his soul to join a family that was already planning to use him as a legal shield for their own crimes. I stood on my balcony as they were led out, the blinding strobe of red and blue police lights reflecting off the glass of the neighboring buildings. I watched the red and blue lights strobe against the walls of my new home, a clean, quiet sanctuary that Silas would never see again, and I finally closed the door on the wreckage of my past. The smell of industrial-grade floor cleaner and stale despair was a far cry from the lavender and rosemary of our old garden, but it was the only air Silas had left to breathe, and I was the one who had filtered it for him. I sat in the visiting block of the Federal Detention Center, the taste of metallic recirculated air dry on my tongue. The silence that followed the departure of the sirens a few days ago had been the first real peace I'd known since Catherine died. Yet here I was, back in the presence of the structural failure I had finally stopped trying to patch. Silas was led into the booth by 2 guards, his gait heavy and stripped of the polished stride he had practiced for years. The standard-issue orange jumpsuit drained the last of his perceived status, making him look pale and diminished against the stark, clinical walls. He snatched up the receiver, his face pressing against the scratched glass. "Dad, thank God," he rasped, his eyes darting frantically. "Tell me the lawyer is outside. Tell me you brought the check for the bail. $250,000, Dad. That's all. I can fix this if I'm out." I sat in silence, watching the erratic, desperate energy of my son through the barrier. Silas revealed then that the alliance he had traded his soul for was already dust. Natalie had signed a plea deal that morning to testify against him in exchange for a lighter sentence. Her final betrayal was just as clinical as my own demolition. "I brought a folder, Silas," I said, picking up the cold, greasy texture of the intercom phone, "but it doesn't contain a check." He was beating his fists against the glass like a bird trapped in a cockpit, unaware that the plane had already landed and the engines were cold. He was waiting for a rescue mission, unable to grasp that I was here to conduct a final inspection of the wreckage. I leaned in my voice, sounding more like the lead engineer I once was than the father he remembered. I'm not posting your bail, Silas, nor am I hiring a private defense attorney for you. You're leaving me in here, he screamed, the sound muffled by the glass but sharp through the receiver. I'm your son. I looked at him with a resolute clarity. I'm treating you like a man, Silas. It's a courtesy you've never actually earned. A bridge built with intentionally weakened steel will always collapse under the weight of reality. You've spent 30 years hollowing out your own integrity, and now you're going to have to face the full weight of your choices without a safety net. This incarceration isn't a mistake to be fixed. It's the only correction that can save what's left of your soul. Have you ever looked at your own legacy and realized the only way to save it was to let it burn? It's a quiet kind of heartbreak. I watched the hope drain from his face, replaced by a hollow, haunting realization. I told him then that the $250,000 he was begging for, the exact amount of the bail, had been donated to the Scholarship Foundation that morning. It was now an emergency fund for students facing unexpected financial crises, people who understood the value of a foundation. I hung up the intercom receiver and walked toward the exit, the screech of the heavy steel doors echoing behind me. The sound of Silas's muted screams against the glass faded as I stepped back into the honest light of the afternoon. The mission was finally surgically complete. The soft, hopeful hum of a university auditorium, filled with students who actually deserved to be there, was a sound I hadn't realized I was starving for. I stood backstage, the smell of old books and floor wax grounding me as I clutched the heavy parchment of the Katherine Garrison Memorial Scholarship Charter. The applause in the auditorium didn't sound like the polite, expensive golf claps of an Ashford gala. It sounded like a structural foundation finally locking into place. When I stepped onto the stage, the thunderous sound of genuine applause washed over me, a physical force that made the clinical silence of the detention center feel a lifetime away. I looked out at a sea of faces that represented hard work and raw potential, and I saw Elena Rodriguez sitting in the front row, her eyes bright with a future she no longer had to fear. A bridge doesn't care about your last name, I told them, my voice steady and resolute. It only cares if the math is honest. True engineering isn't about the image you project. It's about the integrity of the hidden supports. This foundation is for those who know the value of a day's work and the weight of a promise. I officially launched the fund knowing the $943,000 Silas once viewed as his personal inheritance was now a perpetual engine for social mobility. A legacy isn't something you leave behind. It's a frequency you set. I had finally found someone tuned to the right station. To ensure this frequency never drifted, I had composed the foundation board entirely of retired engineers from my old firm, men and women who valued a decimal point as much as a handshake. Silas would never find a way to manipulate his way back into these funds. After the ceremony, I found Patricia Morrison waiting for me in the lobby. She looked as sharp and clinical as ever, but there was a flicker of something resembling satisfaction in her eyes as she handed me a final file. The Ashfords are liquidating their Seattle holdings to cover the federal legal fees, Patricia said quietly. The corporate espionage investigation has turned their empire into a radioactive zone. And Silas is, well, he's exactly where his choices led him. Data doesn't lie, Patricia, I replied with a grim nod. It just eventually becomes impossible to ignore. As the crowd thinned, Elena Rodriguez found me by the edge of the stage. She looked at me with a reverence that made my throat tight. I saw the calluses on her capable hands, the same marks of honest labor that Katherine had carried. I reached into my pocket and retrieved the 1952 Hamilton watch. This belonged to a man who built the tracks we still walk on, I said, placing the cold, rhythmic instrument into her palm. It's not for show. It's for keeping time when the work gets hard. Tick, tick, tick. The Hamilton was finally home. I'll make sure it never stops ticking, Mr. Garrison, she promised, and I knew she meant it. The local news snippet on a nearby monitor caught my eye as I prepared to leave. It mentioned that Silas's only remaining assets were the designer suits he couldn't sell because they were bought. With a flagged fraudulent credit card, He was physically dressed as a man he could no longer afford to be a walking ghost of a dead ambition. I walked out into the cool November air, the taste of it clean and crisp. The weight of the past had finally lifted, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't look back to see if anyone was following me. Thanksgiving used to be a performance of family unity staged over Catherine's heirloom china, but this year the only thing on the table was the truth, and it tasted better than any feast Silas ever demanded. I stood in my new study, a final glance at the Foundation's mission statement, hanging on the wall, reminding me of the price of that truth. The cool November air was still, and the weight of the past felt finally lifted, as I prepared for a holiday defined by peace rather than pretense. I met with Patricia Morrison one last time to settle the final accounts of our legal campaign. The smooth texture of the court documents felt like a finished blueprint in my hands. She confirmed that Natalie had attempted to sue her own father for her lost wedding expenses, a move of such staggering entitlement that the Ashfords had completely cut her off, leaving her as destitute as the man she had tried to use. As for Silas, he had avoided jail time through a plea, but the cost was high. He's working at a logistics warehouse, Thane Patricia said, sliding a status report across her desk. Entry level, heavy lifting. I reviewed the court-ordered payment schedule. Silas was now required to pay back the $89,000 in identity theft damages directly to the Foundation. Good, I replied, my voice reflecting a resolute sense of justice. He needs to understand how many hours of sweat it takes to build what he tried to burn down in an afternoon. Restitution is like a slow-setting concrete. It's heavy, it's messy, but eventually it's the only thing that makes the ground walkable again. It was the only way for the structural integrity of his character to ever be restored, if such a thing was even possible. A week later, on Thanksgiving afternoon, I stood on my balcony. The cold wind whistled against the glass, but I was focused on the vibrant red roses. They had surprisingly survived the transplant and the early frost, standing defiant against the gray Seattle sky. I stepped back inside the scent of a small roasting turkey beginning to fill the condo. The distant hum of holiday traffic was a low, soothing drone. Silence. No buzzing phones, no frantic demands. Just the wind and the clock. My tablet chimed with a digital card from Elena Rodriguez. It was a photo of her and the other scholarship recipients, crowded around a table at the university library, their faces lit with the kind of ambition that doesn't require a designer label. I realized then that while I had lost a son to greed, I had gained a family through purpose. We did it, Catherine, I whispered to the empty room. The Foundation is holding. The load is distributed. Just as I sat down to eat, I noticed an anonymous envelope that had been slipped under my door. Inside was a small, hand-drawn thank you from the child of the family that bought the Victorian house. It was a crude drawing of a flower, but it was proof that the home was still fostering life, and that the ground I'd cleared was already growing something new. I picked up my fork and looked out at the city lights, knowing that while my name might end with me, the bridges I'd built would carry people I'd never meet into a future I'd finally secured. The city below was a tapestry of lights, thousands of individual stories held up by the bridges and beams. People like me had spent their lives perfecting, and for the first time, I didn't feel the weight of a single one. I finished my solitary Thanksgiving meal, the simple flavors of roasted turkey and home-cooked sides lingering on my tongue. I stood in my quiet condo, looking at the photo of the first Catherine Garrison scholarship class, and felt a profound final peace. I stepped out onto the balcony, wrapping a heavy coat around my shoulders as the biting cold of the November night air met me. The railing felt solid cold and true beneath my palms, a tactile anchor in the dark. I looked at the city through the eyes of an engineer, noting the structural integrity of the skyline and the rhythmic distant flow of traffic humming in the streets below. My mind drifted to the project name I had lived with for over a year, 3K7. It wasn't a random string of characters. It was the specific stress test designation for the first bridge I ever designed with Catherine. It was a structure built to withstand a 100-year storm, a testament to the fact that we had always planned for the long-term survival of the things we loved. I realized then that the most difficult engineering feat of my career wasn't a bridge or a wing, but the systematic deconstruction of my own bloodline to save our legacy. Static load, dynamic load. It all comes down to the foundation, I whispered into the wind. You were right, Catherine. Some things have to be dismantled before they fall and take everything else with them. I could smell wood smoke and the crisp, clean scent of the lake water nearby. A man's life is like a cantilevered beam. Too much weight on the end and the whole thing snaps at the root. I'd move the weight back to the foundation, back to the students who would actually use the light I'd left behind to build their own futures. I looked up at the night sky, my eyes searching for the North Star. It stood there unyielding and fixed the ultimate reference point for any navigator. I thought of Silas likely finishing a grueling shift at a logistics warehouse, his soft hands finally learning the grit of honest labor. I thought of Natalie probably realizing that the Ashford name was a currency she could no longer spend. I felt no malice, no lingering heat of revenge, only the cold, clear relief of a mission accomplished. The Catherine Garrison Foundation would outlive my grief, and it would outlive my son's greed. Do you feel that that's not the wind? That's the feeling of a debt finally being paid in full. The stars don't care about our titles, I mused, watching them twinkle with an indifferent brilliance. They only care about the light we leave behind once the power's cut. Project 3K7, mission complete. I took a deep breath of the freezing air and realized I had finally stopped being Silas's father, or the embittered widower, or even just the engineer. I was simply Thane, a man who chose honor over blood, and for the first time in my life, that was enough. The variables had stabilized. The structure was secure. I turned back toward the warmth of my home, leaving the shadows of the old Victorian and the ghost of the man I used to be out in the cold. I finally closed the door on the story of the Garrisons, and the lock clicked with a sound that signaled a total, perfect freedom. I walked inside and didn't look back. Looking back, I realized my greatest engineering failure wasn't a bridge, but the years I spent funding a lie. My open wallet was never a substitute for true fatherhood. Don't be like me. Don't mistake silence for peace or allow your kindness to provide the blueprint for someone else's greed. This family story taught me that accountability is the only way to save a legacy. When I witnessed this family betrayal, I had to dismantle the past to protect the future. I believe the Lord's timing is always perfect, leading me away from a hollow life and towards students who truly value the weight of a promise. My family story ends here, but yours continues. Don't let a family betrayal define you. Instead, let it be the catalyst to build your life on honest math. This family story of family betrayal is a testament that truth is the only foundation that holds. Thank you for walking with me to the end of this journey. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How would you have handled Silas's betrayal if you were in my shoes? Your perspective matters to me. If this message resonated with you, please subscribe so we can share more journeys together. A brief note: while inspired by real-world social dynamics and family complexities, certain elements have been dramatized for narrative depth. If this style of storytelling isn't for you, I encourage you to explore other content that better suits your preferences.